Yeah, we're like, I'm 37 floors up.
So it's funny. I've seen you do videos. Obviously, you were from there, and I thought you were like rented a studio or something. Like, I didn't realize this is your house where you live.
Yeah, so that's like downtown Honolulu right here.
This doesn't seem.
My head's in the way. It's over there. Then there's a harbor, and then like right here, the ocean's like 2 blocks away.
Welcome to Cabernet and Pray, the podcast where we explore Christianity through the beauty of wine. And today I get to make a new friend. Today's episode is with Kevin Sweeney. This is someone who I have seen online for a while now. I followed from afar, partly because he lives in Hawaii, and that obviously creates a certain level of distance there, but hadn't had the chance to get to know him. And as you'll see in this episode, we quickly became friends. And this was one of those kindred spirits. And even after the episode, we found ourselves just chatting for a while, just talking to each other and reminiscing on so many shared experiences and things that we've been through together. So hopefully you pick up on all of that. A little intro into Kevin. He was the co-founder and lead pastor of Imagine Church for almost 10 years. And he talks about that story on this episode. He's the host of the podcast, The Church Needs Therapy, just so great. And he's a best-selling author of 2 books, with his third on the way. The books are The Making of a Mystic and The Joy of Letting Go. Kevin currently lives and surfs in Honolulu with his wife and co-founder of Imagine, Christine, and their 2 kids, True and Michaela.
I've never shared this with anybody publicly. There's so many things happening in this conversation right now. 1,000 years from now, people are going to be looking at this podcast saying, so this was the breakthrough.
If this was SportsCenter, that would be like such a hot take. Skip Bayless would have no idea. Stephen A. Smith would have no idea what to say if you drop that down. That is so good.
The joke I always say is like, how'd you learn so much? You got to drink a lot.
The power of food and beverage to lubricate an environment.
Resistance to change is hurting the church.
I'm not in the camp that God has a penis or a vagina or a body at all. I'm in the camp that God is a universal spirit.
This is the strangest podcast that I have been on. I don't even know what to do.
I'm kind of geeked up about this wine.
So this is my second glass, and it delivers a little more of a punch than I expected. So if I get a little loopy, it's your fault. You told me to drink on the show.
You've uncovered the mystery. You've exposed the formula.
You've just duct taped together a number of things that aren't normally hanging out together, and I'm here for it.
We're going to sit down at a table, we're going to have a glass of wine and some food, and we're going to talk about the beauty of Jesus.
Thank you for the hospitality that this particular podcast provides folks like myself, and I know others, to be curious around their faith practices.
I will never forget the first time I bought a bottle of wine by myself, which was yesterday.
If you're familiar with drunk history, I thought it's like drunk theology. So
By the way, drinking this Pinot Grigio at 3 o'clock in the afternoon is making me even more direct in my communication than I normally would be.
All right. Well, welcome to the podcast, Kevin. Great to have you today.
Yeah, man, I appreciate it. It's good. It's good to meet, good to see each other from different places in the world and to have this moment. The moment, no matter what happens after, the moment's enough, and hopefully I didn't mean to start off so much like this right away, but as we transition into the second half of our life, I'm like, the moment is the thing, that's the big journey, is trusting in the ability to enjoy and trusting the ability to enjoy this or whatever this is in the moment. So yeah, I'm grateful to be here.
Well, let's find out what this is. Let's begin by talking about what we're drinking. I'll start us off. Kevin's going to throw a curveball. Some of our guests throw us curveballs, so Kevin's got one planned for us. But I'm going to drink wine today. We're also in different time zones, so I'm in afternoon. Kevin's in the morning. But today I'm drinking a beautiful Cabernet Sauvignon. This is called Hall. It's from Napa Valley. It's a 2019. I've had this one before years ago until I saw it at Total Wine the other day, and I was like, ooh, I want to see how that is. And it's still good. They're still cranking out good things. What I get on this one is blackberry, black cherry, leather, graphite, and then some black pepper. So this one, pretty traditional cab. It's got a lot of those kind of darker notes to it. It is a little bit heavier, but I'm drinking it without food. I've already had lunch, so I'm just enjoying this wine. Kevin, what are you drinking today? You're going to a lighter approach.
I am. See, just for people to listen, I'm gonna crack it open right now. So it's a June Shine, which is a hard kombucha, which is started by guys from San Diego and Hawaii. So there's a connection to out here too. I remember being at one of their early launch parties, but probably when they had their first few accounts out here at a hotel. So yeah, it's 10 a.m. It's Friday. This is our first like bigger south swell of the season. So I live in Honolulu, the south shore of Oahu, and so April, probably more Mayish, is the time where the waves transition from the North Shore, where it's big during the winter and still good in the spring, to where we're at now, where it's good all summer. So it's our 24-hour news cycle is more tides, wind, and waves than it is what's happening in the political news cycle out here for a lot of people. So this is a big day for a lot of people who live in town. So yeah, some 10 a.m., something light allows me to keep going after this.
Okay, well, before we can get into anything of substance, people are going to want to know, what's it like living in Hawaii? I mean, you've got a view outside your window that's ridiculous. You're talking about surfing. I mean, is Hawaii as awesome as us mainlanders think it is?
Yeah, and there's people out here who, even though mainland's the most common term, people out here also say the continent, because it doesn't center like, no, for us, that's not the mainland. This is the mainland.
Right.
That's the continent. This is where we are. This is, I've seen a map before that I think someone had painted on their walls where like Hawaii's at the center of a flat globe, because that's where we're at.
Yeah.
It is that beautiful. And it is that special. And the ancient culture of native Hawaii that's still here and very alive and very visible and felt and present. All the different cultures that have migrated here, a lot of that's through like the sugar plantations and the history of like people coming to work and people being brought here, and how it created a really unique local culture. It's warm all year. Some of the best waves in the world. My wife and I both surf. Our kids are 5 and 7. They surf. And so it's my favorite place in the world. But also, I don't know if people on the continent know about this, but it's also one of the most unlivable places when it comes to cost of living. It's one of the most expensive places to live in the country, but it doesn't have industries that always match that. So people talk about getting priced out of paradise. A lot of native Hawaiians having to move out for the sake of money and housing and land and everything. So it's beautiful, but there's also another very real, the struggle of day-to-day life here is different than what people think. So it's both, it's all those things. And it's my favorite place. So yeah,
well said. Here. Well said. I like it. Okay, so let's get into a little bit of your journey for people who want to know more about you. And this is a question I like asking our guests to kind of set the tone, because so much of the spiritual experience is a journey, right? We don't just wake up one day, or we're not born with all perfect doctrine and ways of understanding God, and then we just hold on to it. We grow and we evolve and we change and we learn. And so I would love to hear from you. If you look at like the last 10 years of your life, how has your faith changed over the last decade?
That's a good question. Usually, and pretty much all the time, if I get this question, it's more beginnings, for me, and how my own existential crisis as a teenager and my journey towards an awakening when I was 18 and what happened after. But the last 10 years, let's see, I'm 39 years old. Are you still like, you're a pastor, right? Still?
So I refer to myself as the wine pastor, but I'm not on staff at a church. I speak at churches. Okay. I do this podcast where we talk to, all sorts of spiritual leaders and wine people, but not, I was a lead pastor, not formally anymore.
Okay. Gotcha. I feel like I saw that connection somewhere, on Instagram. So yeah, 10 years ago right now, let's see, May, my wife and I had just started a church. We were church planners. Like, we moved back here with multiple reasons, but a bigger picture to start a church. So we were still at this point in 2014, still meeting in our home. We intentionally said we're going to stay meeting in our home for about a year, and it ended up being closer to a year and a half. And those were some of our convictions and life around the table and creating a culture and what the home feels like, etc. So, man, from 10 years until now, I had, when everyone's right now talking about deconstruction and stages of evolution, my first major stage of deconstruction, which if you look at spiral dynamics or other developmental maps, I always tell people, like, what people call deconstruction is simply the movement from one stage of faith or one stage of consciousness to another. And if you keep evolving, there will be more, so I have like a zoomed out perspective to see that. But I had already gone through that. So I wasn't the pastor who's like, oh my gosh, I'm 5 years into my congregation and I created a culture and a system that I now don't fit in. Do I silence my voice and just like white knuckle and stay here for security? Or do I embrace my authentic path but have to leave or try to help it grow with me? Like that tension a lot of people feel. That wasn't my story. I had already changed so much, and I was studying Black and womanist and liberation theology in grad school, and I started in a very different place. So thankfully I didn't have that experience. So I think besides theologically and evolving and growing, I think for me, it was a lot of the personal parts of growing that comes from the challenges and the pain and the struggles of just being a pastor and loving people and being close. Like, I felt a pastoral calling in my early 20s, which I didn't really know what that meant, but I was very much embracing it. And at one point I thought I was going to stay in the academy. But I look back at my desire to stay in the academy and I say, I still wanted to express my desire to teach or preach, which I love. But I felt like the academy allowed me to avoid two of my greatest fears in life up until that point, which was disappointing people close to me and failing publicly. I just felt like teaching was like, I can come out, teach, and then hide again. I can come out, teach, but a responsibility for the whole and relational proximity and intimacy and the messiness that comes from incarnational life, I was still scared of that. There was risks there emotionally that teaching didn't require of me. So I think my growth for 10 years was embracing failure and letting because all my fears come true. You do all those things, you fail. Like the secret is not it doesn't happen, it's that it does happen.
Right.
And like Patton Oswalt, the stand-up comedians, like for all early stand-up comedians, I just want them to bomb. Just go out there and you're done. Like you're dead, because that's your greatest fear. And when it happens, you take a deep breath and you feel some type of way. Then you're like, but I'm okay. Like no longer is my fear of the negative going to stop me from giving myself fully here. So I think a lot of my own transformation came from, I am going to disappoint some people when they're close to me, make some mistakes, have to apologize. Relationships are going to end. Not as many people are going to show up to this particular thing we're doing. I have to feel all of that. The great sort of one of the great fathers of centering prayer, Thomas Keating, charts the process of transformation as a series of necessary humiliations to the ego. That's how you grow. I just spent all this time teaching, prepping, blah, 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 to do this thing. And it's, there's 4 people here. Cool.
Right.
Like, can I still give myself fully, even though that part of my ego that still thinks a crowd somehow validates what I'm doing feels humiliated? And can I feel that all the way through and start to transcend it and live beyond it? So I could talk all kinds of ways about how my understanding and my theologies evolved, which I'm more than willing to do. But for me, it was very personal of embracing all of that and being like, we can still keep going, even though I faced all those things that I was scared of.
Now, you're not doing that role that you were in the church anymore, correct?
Right. So we actually, in about 2 weeks or so, May 29th, are coming up on a 2-year anniversary of my wife and I closing down our church. So we didn't just transition out of the role, we actually closed the entire church down.
What was the reason for that?
Yeah, that was COVID. Hawaii was one of the most strict states when it comes to rules and lockdowns and all that stuff. And I think after 18 months of not meeting consistently, we're doing digital and all the stuff everyone's doing, which I will say pastorally was all good and necessary and a part of adapting for the sake of serving people and sustaining the church. But on another level, it sucked. Like, it's just horrible. It's like, what this is, I don't even want to watch on a Sunday, and I'm the one who did it. Like, I'm not, like, honestly, at the end, I'm not watching because it wasn't live, like it was live, but I had recorded it earlier. I'm like, I'll just go watch Frozen and just cuddle with my daughter right now because I'm over this, So when we went to reopen after 18 months, my wife and I, after just watching The Last Dance with Michael Jordan, we're like, this is our last dance. Like, this is our last chapter here. Because I always sensed I would do it for about 10 years. And through COVID, I was approaching the 9-10 year marker. And we thought it was like, this will be a 2-year chapter. We'll rebuild it, and then we'll see what happens. And probably 4 to 5 weeks into reopening, just intuitively, pretty close to immediately, I just knew this is the last chapter, but it's not a rebuilding one. This is coming to an end. And, my wife and I were in this extended 3-month conversation of like, wow, like, are we really going to close this? Because we're probably 37 at the time. Like, my wife has a private practice. She's a therapist, so she's killing it. But for me, and we have kids and lives and things to take care of, it's like, whoa, am I going to start over at 38? That's a big risk. And as we get older, it becomes harder to risk because it's more of a risk.
Yeah.
And we made a decision to close it down over Christmas. And despite the pain and the grief, which is all real, our community allowed us to announce that and go through that process with complete grace. Like, when we announced to the church we were closing, it was in person, we're telling stories, we're crying, we're laughing, my wife and I. When we were finally done telling the story, everyone stood up and gave us a standing ovation.
That's cool.
Like, that's how it was received. And yeah, there was hurt. And of course, like, we had a season to like work through all that and to enjoy each other in the end. But yeah, I will say the thing I'm thankful for is neither my wife or I, who led it together, felt the unnecessary obligation to keep it going in order to somehow maintain its value. We said, this doesn't have to exist in perpetuity. This doesn't have to exist. This not existing beyond us does not devalue the almost decade we just had. Let's let it be. Real organisms live and die. That was amazing. It's hard, but I'm proud of that. I had a great experience doing it, to be honest. And that's over. And so, yeah, I'm like 2 years removed from that, basically.
That's very well said. When people are talking about you, and a lot of even your language, the word mystic gets brought up a lot. And I'm curious, how do you view yourself in that role?
Yes, 99.9% of people who refer to themselves as a mystic, this is secret. Deep down, I'm like, no. But I still do that for myself.
Over that, yes, for me.
Now, there's an overall, like, if Richard Rohr talks about the move towards the mystical, to me, that's different because that's, I think, a collective transition from a belief-based faith to an experiential-based faith. Not what do you believe, but do you actually know? Not what abstract beliefs do you hold about God or Jesus, but do you actually have direct realization and experience of God and the divine for yourself in an awakening and transformative way? Not just what do you believe about the shape of the container, but how well are you connected with and consumed by the substance of God?
Yeah.
So the simple thing about a mystic is the mystic is one whose life is defined by direct experience of the sacred. And so even in my own journey, which our journey is our journey, and I love that word as well, my experience began like no youth groups, didn't know evangelicals existed, went to Catholic church as a kid and stopped going, didn't really think about it. I had my own crisis, my own seeing through illusions of, I thought if I was going to play basketball in college, I would be happy. You know, I thought if I had this many people addicted to the attention, typical story, you know, and drugs and alcohol are very much a part of that. And they weren't doing that. And I was just like, well, what am I doing? And when I had this spontaneous awakening moment with God, it was direct, embodied experience and trusting the inner authority I had simply as a conscious human being to know what just happened. I just experienced God. I didn't have anybody confirming that, giving me language to make sense of it at that point. All I had was my own journey and what I knew. So I feel like I almost grew up backwards compared to a lot of my peers. Is they're handed a belief system. And then they believe those things. They're like, I believe these things. And when we're young, we're over-identified with our beliefs. We think we are our beliefs. Like we think we are our thinking.
We label each other.
Say it again.
That's how we label each other. Like you
are.
are.
But even for ourselves, it's like we're so over-identified with beliefs. We don't have this conscious experience of, I have beliefs. Like as if I'm holding them in my hand. No, I have beliefs that are ever changing and in flux and can do it. No, like I actually feel like I am my beliefs and my belief system. That's not the same thing as having beliefs. That's why Ken Wilber talks about, you know, your belief system isn't just beliefs. It's actually the home for it's like a house for your ego. It's what makes your ego feel safe. It's what makes your ego feel like I have a place. That's why when you challenge somebody's beliefs, the ego has like a contracted death seizure reaction. That's what he calls it, to that, because for me to challenge your beliefs is actually to challenge what makes you feel at home and what makes you feel like yourself. No, the mystic says, no, you're not those beliefs. Whatever you are, whatever I am is beneath, before, and beyond those beliefs. There is a self that is much deeper than and precedes the beliefs that we have. So the mystic has beliefs, but does not hold them the same way as other people. The mystic has beliefs, but but consciously knows I am not those beliefs. If I'm this body and you take away a belief out of my hand, I can look around and smile and be like, I'm still me. It's cool. It's fine. We're all fine here. That's why when people are deconstructing and evolving, direct experience carries you through so well, because you can let your beliefs change when you know you aren't those beliefs. It's no one's trying to kill you. You're simply growing in how you see the world. That's normal. That's natural. That's a healthy thing. You know, like that's not to be resisted. So the direct experience is the thing, you know, I think for people. Yeah. Of why I am so comfortable with that term, and why the mystics are the great poets and lovers they are, because they're not arguing about beliefs. You know, I don't argue about directions to the ocean when I'm in the ocean. I'm just in it. You can argue about how to get here all you want, because I'm just trying to remain in it to the point where I become it. I don't care how you got here. And I don't argue about the chemical makeup of salt water either. I'm not arguing about that. We're just in it, you know? So that's how I would say it.
I love that. You know, it also strikes me, one of the reasons we do this is because when I hold, you know, certain beliefs, then a tribe is often formed around those, right? We all hold these beliefs together. Now I'm finding a secondary association and identity through the tribe because of a shared belief, which I think also messes people up when they go, well, I don't know if I believe this thing as much as I used to. And on one level, you're dealing with that, right? But then you're also dealing with, what does that mean for me in my standing in this group if I no longer believe this? And I think that's what makes it hard for people.
Absolutely.
And to be a mystic, but there's obviously so much power there, the way you're saying, just experience it in the moment.
There's so many barriers towards us allowing ourselves to evolve and grow. And one of those is institutional acceptance. And one of the biggest ones, especially in the early stage people often go through when they talk about deconstruction, is the tribal belonging. I remember I was 24. I think I was about to finish my undergrad, and I was already in a very different place, you know, reading progressive folks and deconstructing and doing all that. So even at that point, I was in a very different place than my tribe I was a part of, which was low church, charismatic, Foursquare people, you know, at the time, the first churches I was really a part of. And I actually was visiting a church out here in Hawaii. My wife and I were out for a couple of weeks. We lived in Orange County in California after we got married for 5 years. And I listened to a church that I think has like sort of Calvary Chapel-ish connections. And I listen, and I'm like, oh, this is like one of the cooler churches like people my age are going to from what I saw from a distance. I'll go check it out. The sermon I heard was so ridiculous and problematic. It was like demons and like nationalism and like war metaphors. It was just a mockery, of like the good news. And I remember at the end, they give an altar call, right? And I'm like, what are you asking people to say yes to after that? Like, I'm still like that. I could so wholeheartedly disagree with someone and think what they're saying is genuinely like problematic and dangerous, and be like, but just the fact you have the audacity and courage to still call people that, like, that's awesome. Like, that's amazing. It's scary where you're calling them to, but the fact that you do it still blows me away. I'm like, I respect that part.
You respect the hustle. Yeah, I like it.
I do. I'm like, I'd be so embarrassed after that. I would never ask anybody if anything.
Right.
And he gives this all, and I get it. I've been in those environments, like classic, like head down, every head bowed. Like, I've been in those places, and you can have very real experiences in those places. And I was in the back, and I started getting emotional, and I started welling up with tears, which is funny. Some nice lady in the church is probably like, pastor, like, got another young wanderer, young man coming home to the Lord. But I say that story because of what you were just saying. In that moment, I just had this moment of clarity of like, I can't be a part of these kinds of places. Mm-hmm. It's not just personal preference. It's actual conviction, integrity, and alignment of how I see and understand the way of Jesus. And I started getting emotional because I immediately felt the possible alienation that will come from that. I'm not going to get it. All my friends, we graduated Bible college. They're not going to invite me to speak at their churches. I'm not going to have those camaraderie-based relationships, which are amazing. Like the friendships, and we're all on the same page, and we speak at each other's churches, and we do all this. I'm like, when you start to grow and evolve, something within you intuitively senses all of the social implications or economic implications of what that means. Mm-hmm. And that's really hard. There's no glib, funny, clever answers to get around that. That stuff's just hard, and it involves real grief. And while I don't do it, I get why people stay in places they've outgrown because they're not ready and they don't have the courage yet to accept whatever consequences come from their evolution. But if you ever want to keep growing and live with integrity, you have to. And there will be grief, and you will lose relationships, not because you want to, but because you're no longer in the tribe. And that tribal belonging is one of the most powerful forces like there is. Because historically, that's how we survived, like in ancient times, that's why it's there, because that's how you survive. And that's a real thing. And there is a lot of loss there. But for the mystic and for people who keep growing, eventually you're like, everything I've ever let go of was simply getting in the way of my own freedom anyways. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's grief for that. There's cost. There's one of the things I say in the intro to my first book is the peace the mystic has in public comes out of the tears they've shed in private.
Ooh.
All the grief, all the letting go, all the criticism you take, whatever it is, the things people say when they don't understand what you're doing, that's all very real. But if I can embrace that into my body, grieve over it, which oftentimes happens through tears, all I keep gaining is more and more of who I really am and a deeper union with the Christ that holds all things together. So is there a loss? Yes, but what you gain is yourself. And that's always I keep trusting that.
Well said. Mm-hmm. You have a podcast with a great title. I'd love to know what's behind it. The title is The Church Needs Therapy. A little tongue in cheek, maybe. What's behind that brand?
I mean, one, I just think it's funny, so that usually I'll think something's really funny, then I'll build like a more sophisticated answer around that. But a part of that is, despite me leaving congregational life in a pastoral sense, which like I'm not a part of a local church now. I would love to one day. It's a bit hard for me to find, a place out here that makes sense for me and would make sense for them as well. But I really hope to find that. But the church needs therapy is, of course, there's all of the critique. Of course, we're challenging white Christian nationalism. Of course, we're challenging all of the things we can sit around and talk about. People are talking about right now, and they should be. But also, that's for the sake of transformation and growth. I started our church already past the angry and oppositional stage of deconstruction and growth. That first big stage, yes, there will be a season of like real oppositional energy. Like, let's sit around, we're going to have some drinks with our friends, and we're just going to talk all this about the church. Fine, that's normal. That's a part of growing. But we don't stay there. Mm-hmm. Like even Roar's, Center for Action and Contemplation, one of their taglines is the best criticism of the bad is the practice of the better. The church is no longer valuable. No, there's liberating versions of the church and there's oppressive versions of the church. There's loving, inclusive, welcoming versions of the church, and there's exclusive, alienating, self-preserving versions of the church. There's always a way forward. So even the people don't go to therapy when they're hopeless. They go to therapy because they have hope. A hopeless person doesn't go to therapy. Therapy is like maybe, or there is still the possibility of a life that gets bigger and wider and better and more hopeful and more filled with joy. So the church needs therapies. Yes, I have all my critiques, and I've had those for a long time. I've been saying this I'm tired. I'm tired of saying, everybody else can say I'm tired of it, because for me, and this is to me at the heart of being a Christian, the real energy and magic of it is the incarnational life. What do we keep creating? How do we keep loving? What do we keep building? Yes, we've gone through those stages, being angry, grieving over that. The question for me is, who has the courage to keep loving? Who has the courage to keep their heart open when you have a million reasons not to? And we do. From personal hurt, from cultural cynicism, from political environment, where there's a million reasons to shut down your heart. And I don't judge people for that. But who has the courage to remain open and to continue to embody the way forward? That's the journey for me. So the church needs therapy is, yeah, of course. Let's say what we have to say. Let's dismantle, but that's all for the sake of clearing out a path to keep building and keep growing and keep creating. Yeah.
Well, and you obviously imply a metaphor with a willingness to put work in, right? If you're going to therapy, there's a willingness of, this is going to require something of me, but because I have the hope, I'm willing to put the work in. And I love pairing that with the church. We're willing to put the work in to make it better with the hope that it could be better, but we also are going to have to work through some probably heavy things.
Yeah. And that always, like, I'm with my publisher, like I'm like the editor, whatever they call it, the editor organizer of like a compilation book that's coming out. It's called like, I forget what it's like it's like Everyday Mystics, basically, right? Because I'm asking people, if we talk about being a mystic and direct experience of God, not defined just by our beliefs, but by that experience, what does that actually mean for a Friday at 10 a.m.? What does that mean if you're a pastor and a mystic? How does that liberate you to lead differently and in a more healthy way? And the work you're talking about for the mystic, if beneath everything is the radical and universal yes over your life. Like that was my first experience of God, was a universal affirmation of life. You're good. Like that was my first experience. I've always trusted that and grown into that. And you can do that work, face those things, face the shadow, face all of the ways we've been complicit in evil and injustice and systemic issues of racism, whatever it is. The mystic can do that. It's okay. That you challenging that part of our identity is not you devaluing me. That's not the same thing. So whenever people are highly defensive, don't want to change, that's just the fragile, insecure ego that's still so over-identified with illusions about who the church is, an unnecessary need for power in a worldly sense, like versions of the church. No, like no one's trying to get rid of the church. We're trying to deconstruct, break down, and break through to build something else. So that work is like, it's ironic. So I'm like, if you really were as Christian as you were and trusted God, you could do that work because God will carry you through that. You are not those things. You are something that's bigger and beyond. You can let go of the ways you saw things for the sake of allowing a new thing to emerge. So there's an irony of the most, based on abstract beliefs, the most dogmatic Christians are the ones who least trust the process of death and resurrection in their life, or are willing to confront the pain. That's the story. The cross, on one level, is an icon of acceptance as from a mystical view of the cross. From my perspective, is Jesus taking everything into him, saying, even all of this does not end what James Finley calls, which I love, the deathless presence of Christ. That keeps going. Let the church die because it'll be born again. Let your version of the way things are supposed to be die. It'll be born again. That's the whole story. We trust for ourselves. We trust in Jesus. And I think we can trust with the church too. So that's what I know. Like there's a lot of things I'm not good at. Like I joke around with people and say 6 years into leading a church, and this is a joke, but it's true. 10 minutes before we were having like a meeting, we didn't really have a whole staff, but our meeting like that, like a leadership thing. 10 minutes before the meeting, I Googled, what do you do in a meeting?
Church staff meeting.
And the funny part is, in my mind, I'm trying to get out of the meeting, and I'm the one responsible for leading the meeting too. And
probably
so
a very short meeting.
Stuff, logistical, all that, I need so much help and all that. But the deep interior journey of trusting death and resurrection, being comfortable with uncertainty, feeling peace even when things are falling apart, I'm like, that's what I know. That's the mystic. That's what we get. The other stuff is a lot. We're going to make a lot, fumble our way through and make mistakes. But the substance of all this, this is everything for us, So, yeah.
I love that. You have referenced already integral theory in a number of ways. And probably a lot of people listening or watching this may not be super familiar with integral theory. You talked about Ken Wilber earlier. Okay, so I have attempted to wrap my head around integral theory. At one point, I was super into it and fascinated. Ultimately, it's one of those I chalk up to really interesting, but I'm not quite sure what to do with it in real life. So when I saw that you do a lot with this, and then you've referenced it, I'm like, okay, I'm going to pick your brain on this. Because one of the challenges I've had with integral theory, one of the reasons I like it is this idea of progression, right? Here's where you are, here's how you see things, here's how they make sense, but you keep going, you keep learning. And I love that concept. One of the things I struggle with is the idea of, and in the book, I read a book called Integral Christianity. I don't know if you've read this one, but it's basically taking, integral theory specifically to the Christian thought. Mm-hmm. And in that book, I remember numerous times was, hey, we don't judge people for where they're at. And there's not this judgment of, well, you haven't arrived where I am yet. I don't know how to practice that because whenever I would try to embody this, there was a sense of hey, you're stuck. Keep going. You've hit a ceiling in this, season you're in, keep going. And it always felt like it created this sense of judgment of well, I'm further than you. So that's why I'm saying it. And I didn't like that feeling at all. So with my own issues just put out there on the table for you, Kevin, how have you found integral theory to be helpful? How have you gotten over the issues I've got with it?
Yeah, that's good. For people who don't know who Ken Wilber is and don't know about, his theory of everything and his integral theory and the all quadrants, all levels, My recommendation is don't read them.
You know what? I can second that, because it made it, I think, harder for me when I was trying to just really sit in that place.
Yeah, mine's more like it just takes so. If people ask me to recommend them books, for me, it's it's always situational for the person, for their personality, and also where they're at in their stage of consciousness and growth and faith. And so this person, I'll be like, actually someone, a writer, who I gave a blurb to his book, reached out to me however many months ago and was like, what couple books would you read? I said, what were the last couple books you read you really resonate with? And he told me, I'm like, I would read these two. And that would be a different answer for you, or a different answer for another friend. And that's just my discernment and my thinking. We all move forward one step at a time. If we go from A to Z, if I sense a person's right around E or F, I'm like, giving them a book at S makes no sense, and it's not helpful. There was times in my journey where I was very much like emergent church, 2008-ish, like that era, Brian McLaren, Tony Jones, Doug Padgett. That was my first big stage of evolution, was through all them. And I remember reading John Caputo for the first time, who's like a continental philosopher, writes about like, the weakness of God. And I remember one summer reading him and reading the book, and it's not even a big book. And I was like, I'm not ready for this. Just like, honestly, I'm like, I don't get it.
Yeah.
And then a year went by, and reading other people, and reading Peter Rollins, and reading people who are referencing him, and people are building on him or drawing from him. And then next summer I was like, oh, like now I can get into this more. Wilbur's like, you really have to be in the right place. So that's just my disclaimer for people. Like, you really got to be ready for that. And that's the next thing drawing you forward. But there's multiple parts to integral. Like, so Ken Wilber, for people listening, not a Christian, created a theory of everything. He would be more like a philosopher of religion, even though I think his orientation skews more Buddhist than anything else. I have been the most immersed in his work for about 10 years. Like, it takes time to get initiated into it. When you read philosophers, like, you have to get initiated into the language. Huh? Say it again.
Your handshake in like a club that you're a part of.
Oh man, like there's so much new stuff, and he's very repetitive, but it's good because it's so complex at first. But I will say, to reference the part you're talking about, Jeremy, of like looking at developmental maps, spiral dynamics, Rob Bell, I think, really popularized for a lot of evangelical-ish kind of folks, probably 10, 12, 14 years ago when he first started talking about it. It's this idea that, Ken Wilber has his own version of that. James Fowler is a pastor who wrote about that a long time ago, Fowler's stages. And they're all different versions of the same thing. And how do you acknowledge people? So your question is like, how do you acknowledge and have a map? Like, think about it like a map. Ken Wilber's a map maker. He's not arguing for a religious point. He's making a map of human consciousness and its development through culture in the world. It's fascinating. And so how do you acknowledge there's a map here and an evolutionary movement forward that you can mark through certain stages, that heals, stages of faith, stages of consciousness, that he says are visible in religious traditions across history and across the world and contemporary psychology. So the question becomes, how can you acknowledge that you would be at what's considered a further stage than somebody without judging or having contempt or having disdain or being like, what the is wrong with you? Why aren't you further than where you are? It's like the pastor. Sometimes it's like the pastor who finally gets something after 8 years of wrestling with it and reading books and being obsessed. And he wants to do a 4-week sermon series and thinks my whole congregation is going to catch up. I'm like, homie, that took you 8 years. You can't just do a sermon series and think they're going to get what the death of God is, like, it'd be cool with that. You're in a church. And so one of the defining markers for Wilber, and people hear this from Rohr and other places, is this idea of transcending and including, right? You transcend the previous stage you were in, but you include the best parts of it, and you include how that is, you're building on that still. Now, when you do the real work of not just transcending, which is the growth, you see more now, your vision is wider. That's fantastic. The real work is the including and acceptance. And how do we do that? So for me, pastorally, knowing about this while I was leading a church, it was one of the greatest gifts for me, Jeremy, to know this stuff while I was leading a church, because I'm like, everybody has the freedom to be exactly where they are. Me being further doesn't make me better. And I can say that to myself. I'm not telling anybody that, but in my mind, I'm like, that doesn't mean I'm better. Doesn't mean I'm more loved. Doesn't mean I'm more accepted by God. Doesn't mean I'm more embraced. It just means I happen to see more because of the work I've done. Now, what that does is actually create a sacred gift and responsibility to help people grow and move forward. And, you know, when spiral dynamics uses like blue, orange, green, for example, you could say 3, 4, and 5, whatever. When I look at somebody, Jeremy, I'm not like, you're at 3, you're 32. Like, why aren't you further? Like, come on, dog. I was doing this 15. This was 15 years ago. No, I'm like, actually, my goal isn't even to get them to go from 4 to 5 or from blue to orange. My goal as a pastor is to help them be the healthiest, most loving, most healed version of them at that particular stage right now, knowing they might not ever go past that stage. And the only part of me that would need them to is some weird insecure ego need that I need to work through. Yes, I don't need you to grow for me, but I acknowledge if you grow, every time we grow, your understanding of reality increases in complexity and it increases in inclusion, who's included in the tribe. So you go from like an ethnocentric to a world-centric to a cosmocentric. I think world-centric, there's a universal humanity and we're all one, is better than being ethnocentric. God's only with our tribe. That one to me is better for the world. But so me wanting you to grow is, this is better for the world and for you, but I don't need it for me. I sleep well at night. I don't need you to be further. And if you're ready to grow, let me push you a little further. But if I don't sense you're ready for the next thing, I'm not forcing you there. I want you to be healthy, healed, and whole wherever you are, knowing you may never grow past that stage. But if you do, I can also help you transition through that. That's why I'm going to give you this book. That's why I'm going to say this to you. You're not, that's not helpful for you right now. So for me, it's just the gift of discerning where people are. It's like a map. If I know I'm looking out like a 37-story window, I'm like, oh, if you're on that road, the best thing is to turn left because at 5 o'clock, it's, you know, that part gets traffic. Oh, if you're over there and you want to surf, the reef is like this. Because I can see, I can help you navigate this world better. But my work is not needing you to be anywhere other than where you are for the sake of my ability to be at peace or have joy. That is just high levels of differentiation when it comes to pastoring, when it comes to leading. So I always found it to be one of that in the Enneagram for types. But for a map, I'm like, man, even for people who are frustrated with their family, I'm like, dude, that's exactly what that person at that stage who sees reality, that's exactly what I can predict what they'll say to you when you say that. Why are you still surprised? Like, why are you surprised when you go home for Thanksgiving, people are saying that? Why are you bothered by that? Like, I can be critical of the things you're saying, but still not be unable to embrace you as a human being while you're saying it. That's my work. So I think for me, that was my guiding sort of ethic and compass of working with the spiral, working with stages of consciousness. This was throughout almost my entire life in the church. Was I don't think I ever told one person in the church about spiral dynamics. Because it's like the Enneagram, like the wisdom of the Enneagram means you don't talk about the Enneagram most of the time. You don't talk, you do if people want to learn about it, but no, the wisdom of the Enneagram does not mean I teach you about the Enneagram. It means with the wisdom and ability I have to see, I can help serve you better. You're an Enneagram 9 who struggles they just fade into the atmosphere, go with the flow, struggle to believe their voice is heard. I know my consistent message to you in the church as a 9 is your voice matters. We want more from you. That's my gift to you, because I can see it. I'm not like, the Enneagram and da-da-da-da. It's like, no, the wisdoms, I don't tell people about the spiral. I'm just able to serve them and guide them, challenge them, embrace them wherever they are, and that is probably one of my favorite parts of pastoring and leading people, is doing that for people. So that's not all of integral theory, by the way, but the stages stuff is a big part of it. And so that for me is one of the helpful, when we talk about a practical pastoral part of that, is that dynamic right there, because you can sense when someone's ready to grow. In integral theory and spiral dynamics, there's different stages like alpha, beta, gamma. I think that's how they say it. But it's like you're either entering into a new stage, being solidified in the stage, or starting to exit a stage. As a practitioner and a person who sees, you can sense that in people. If I think they're looking over the edge of the old, I'm going to give them some stuff that might push them further because they're ready for that. And for me, when Jesus says those who have eyes to see, that's the freedom of a pastor. When people are ready, they'll see it. And Zen, there's a saying, when the student's ready, the teacher appears. And until then, it doesn't matter because they're not ready and they're not open. But when they are, you sense that, and now I can guide you further. So that's my very practical part of that, how that works out.
So everybody, don't read Ken Wilber. Just listen to Kevin on his podcast and read his book, because it'll make way more sense than if you read on it. That was very well said. And it reminds me of Jesus saying, throwing your pearls before swine, of giving people things that they don't need it. That's not helpful, and we think, no, this is good stuff. And it's like, they're not ready for that. So I think that's good. What is something you used to believe that it turned out later you were wrong about?
Probably when I first got introduced to the faith and just heard a conventional classical version of like penal substitutionary atonement. You're separated from God. God sends Jesus as an atoning sacrifice for your sin. You can cross over the sort of gap that exists. And now with that, you can be in union, connected. People who believe that wouldn't probably use union as a word, but now you can be connected with God. So that conventional way of seeing is not, I'm trying to look something up right now, is not how I would see it. And I remember thinking about, even in Bible college, like the difference between concepts and reality, the way we organize the world, like spiritual intelligence and spiritual experience, which I spoke about earlier. And I shared this quote on my Instagram a while ago, and I just pulled it up. And I wrote this. This is like a more of a mystical way of understanding the cross. Now, for me, it's one of the many ways, because to me, there's a multiplicity of ways. The cross is an overabundance of meaning in the cross, which I find amazing. But I wrote, the cross is the bridgeless bridge that allows us to cross over a gap that doesn't exist so we can fully inhabit the space we're already in.
Ooh, I love cross a gap that doesn't exist. That's great.
It's a bridge. So, the whole bridge metaphor. So I'm like, no, the cross is a bridgeless bridge, which is, it's a paradox. The cross is the bridgeless bridge that allows us to cross over a gap that doesn't exist so we can fully inhabit the space we're already in. So it's like a lot of the things, you overcame a gap. No, you're not overcoming a gap that actually exists between you and God. What you're overcoming is the belief that there is a gap. You're not walking across a bridge so you can experience God. You are starting to realize that you're starting to unmask the illusion that a bridge is required to be fully present to God. No. This is a different way of, that's the mystical awakening, is becoming who you already are, and the lifelong sort of tension of what that means and how we work that out, and that's very reflective of how I see religious traditions and how I see rituals and practices as fingers pointing to the moon. That's a Zen saying from D.T. Suzuki. And the religious rituals are very, very valuable, but not for the reasons most people think they are. That's how I have always worked with them. So, yeah.
I love your quote. Makes me picture like this bridge, but it's just set on top of like a piece of land. So like it's not actually connecting anything. It's just like, the irony of a bridge that you're walking across as if there is some gap, but there is no gap. You know what I mean? Like you just walk, someone could walk next to you, not on the bridge, and get to the same place. I love that image. That's great.
Mm-hmm.
What do you see as the main issues facing Christianity in America today?
I mean, some of the quick ones are ones I think many people are talking about very profoundly now. I think for the past 20 years or probably longer, people have been saying it, but the real morphing into a real white Christian nationalist movement is so dangerous and so idolatrous. It's just mind-blowing that it is not more recognizable and visible to people. You know, a church that needs institutional political power for the sake of validation or safety or whatever or preservation is a very, very weak and insecure church that doesn't know who it truly is. You know, so I think that and everything that comes with that, you know, the need to be a part of bearing the history of what the United States is and the idealistic illusion that it is. Like, I think about America on one level as like a collective ego, you know, there's like a collective consciousness to it. So if you work with an individual, say as a therapist or a psychoanalyst, or you have friends, and then like an individual who is completely unwilling to be honest about their history, one will never grow. You can't. You know, like how many times does a pastor have to rhyme a different word of like, you cannot heal what you do not feel. You cannot be. You got like a million different, and those are all great. We have to come up with a million ways to say the same thing. So much transformation is entering into the shadows of the unconscious. This is a part of integral theory too, the shadow work. Entering into the shadows, recognizing the wounds, all of the things we've withdrawn our awareness from, so we don't want to take ownership of, seeing them for what they are, naming them for what they are, integrating them into who we are, and starting to grow beyond them. You can't escape that for individual growth. And so when a country represents a collective ego, you're like, oh, you're just a person who doesn't want to be honest about your past, which means you're highly insecure, you're not willing to own it, and you'll never grow, and that will kill you. The things that you're not willing to own for yourself and consciously die to will kill you. And so I think any of our complicity within any versions of those kinds of faiths, you know, they're not trusting the death and resurrection, like I said. And there's a million things, you know, a church to be more inclusive, more hopeful, more welcoming, you know, more committed to justice, less concerned with platforms, et cetera, et cetera. There's so much to that. And we all know it. You know, we all know what those things are. Like I said about incarnation, this is why I love clergy and love pastors. We just need people to keep creating those spaces. Yeah.
Okay, we're gonna lighten it up a little bit. You've taken us deep. This is a question I like asking because I get so radically different answers on this question, and we're gonna change gears here. So you're ready for a curveball? Mm-hmm. I want you to think about wine now. I assume you do drink wine. Is that correct? I know you're not right now, but it's because it's morning. So imagine it's not morning. Is there a moment, if I were to say to you, Kevin, what was the greatest glass of wine you ever had in your life? Is there a memory that comes to mind of like, it was this glass, or it was this bottle, or it was this dinner, or I was with my wife? Or is there anything that conjures up if I said, have you ever had an incredible moment, to use your word, moment with wine? Do you have anything?
I do remember being in Cinque Terre, Italy with my wife in our late 20s and realizing it's cheaper to buy wine than it is water at restaurants. So that's a funny one. I come from a whole different background of just how we did things, and I'm super cheap and frugal. And I remember how much they charge for water, and I went to the restroom and just filled up my hands, and I was just gulping water. I was like, I'll take the faucet without you knowing. I would just say that entire when I finished grad school in 2012, my wife and I went to Europe for a month. We're like, hey, we can either save 10 grand when we move back to Hawaii and be safe, or we can go to Europe for a month. And we're like, let's just start over when we go to Hawaii. And so that was the first trip I ever drank wine. I was really into beer in my 20s and learned a lot, you know, through that. And I just wasn't drinking wine. And in Europe, it was when I started drinking red wine just all the time. And so I think that entire trip of big transitional season for me, done with grad school, going to start this new endeavor, start a church, and how exciting and scary that was. And that Europe trip was like all of the learning's over, and now it's moving towards the real courage of it. But that whole trip was, this is what made me love wine. So I think that entire Florence, Cinque Terre, it's probably saying that wrong, just France, all over, was a special time, because then I grew to love wine from that trip. So yeah, probably that whole trip.
That's a great answer, and it's hard not to be a wine fan when you're in Europe. They do make that easy. All right, let's wrap this up with a lightning round. Some questions. First thing that comes to mind, just share it.
Quick.
What is something that's blowing your mind right now?
My kids growing up. They're 5 and 7, just how smart they are, sports, connections of the mind, learning how old they look. I'm just in awe and grateful to be pretty present to it right now.
That's cool.
Yeah.
What's the problem you're trying to solve right now?
How to help fund change makers who are doing all of the important work of the spirit and justice and healing and liberation in the world, who do not have places in previous institutions that they were a part of.
Wow. I know.
So I have a new organization that we're starting that's basically doing that.
What's it called?
It's called Rooftop Alliance. And it's not even public yet. I'll talk about it, but it's not like fully public in terms of launching. And yeah, I have a friend who's based out of New York City, who's an amazing story of I want to give the sunset season of my life. His name's Rod Colburn, amazing guy, to create as much change. And he's a longtime Wall Street guy, still works for Deutsche Bank, and has had a radical reorientation of how he sees the world the past 8 years via the Trump era. And he's like, I'm committing the rest of my life to work for justice and liberation. And we're finding a way to create an ecosystem to fund people who are doing some of the work that we see as the most important. Yeah.
That's rad.
Yeah, it's cool.
What's something that you're excited about right now?
One, besides the immediate, is surfing, because it's the first south swell of the season. I haven't surfed in town yet. We call it town. I've surfed on the North Shore when I'm still up. And then, yeah, we're having our first rooftop event. It's very relational, very invite, like on a rooftop, even before we have everything settled. And so that's a big thing. It's the first event of our new organization. And to me, it's a symbolic and real first step of, after an 18-month liminal space, in between space, after closing down our church and waiting and not knowing what's next and trusting that it will emerge on its own time. This is the thing I feel like I'm going to give the next decade of my life to. So that in June, that rooftop event this is the first step towards the next thing. And that's a big deal when I know what a decade takes to keep building something. So it's very special and scary, to do it.
That's very cool. I'm excited to hear about
that.
Yeah. Is there anything else you'd like to add to our interview that I have not asked you, but you're like, man, I really wanted to say that?
I think one, I'm grateful to be invited on here. I don't take for granted connections and relationships. I'm in the most isolated landmass on the planet. So building relationships with people in a transcultural sense to collaborate and work together is not easy. It's easier now. So I really value these kinds of connections. So I'm super grateful for this personally. And I think for people, every time you begin again, a part of you is born again. And as we grow and get older, like I'm almost 40, the real issue for a journey of faith is not whether you're right or wrong. It's whether you're open or closed. Who has the courage to remain open? Who has the courage to begin again? Who has the courage to keep going? These are the things that, to me, define our journey into the second half of our lives. And so, despite a million reasons, Mirabai Starr, who's like an inner spiritual teacher, does stuff with CAC, with Roar and them, amazing writer. I love her work. But she talks about like keeping our hearts open despite every reason not to. And that is very important. And I love that line. And I think that's what faith is in the second half of our life, keeping our hearts open despite every reason not to. That's what I aspire to keep doing. So that's an invitation for all of us.
Well, that's great. All right, Kevin, how can people find you if they are resonating with what you're saying? Where should they go? What should they look at?
Yeah, probably the most consistent at Kevin Sweeney 1 on Instagram. On my feed is like quotes and reels and stuff like that. And then all my stories is my son scoring 36 points as a 5-year-old in his basketball game, and my daughter and him doing all kinds of stuff. My daughter playing soccer. So Instagram, the podcast is called The Church Needs Therapy. You can look it up anywhere, Apple, Spotify. And also, my first 2 books are on Amazon that came out the past couple of years. The first one's called The Making of a Mystic, and the second one's called The Joy of Letting Go. And yeah, those are probably the best places to tap in and kind of follow along and hear more about this. So I appreciate you saying that.
You also have kevinsweeneynow.com.
Yes, my own website is kevinsweeneynow.com. That shows you a bit more of offerings I have, glimpses into kind of the other stuff I'm doing. So yeah, I appreciate that.
Well, Kevin, I think just, we've got to digitally meet for the first time. I've followed you for a while, but I've seen your work from afar, and just hearing your voice now, you really embody what it means to be open. And so I just wanted to say thank you for modeling that. Thank you for inviting people into that. That is something that resonates so deeply with me I just turned 40 this year, and I about to turn 41 actually. And I want to be, that guy that's continually open, continually growing, continually learning. And so I just appreciate when you find another voice that's in there and giving really great wisdom and insight on how to do it. It's huge. So thanks for all the work you're doing, and thanks for taking time out of your surfing day to sit down and drink.
If I can see the surf from here, if the wind shifts to onshore and I don't surf, dude, I'm gonna be mad at you, bro, because I could have surfed. Right?
You know what? We had this moment, Kevin.
That's a good point. You see, you're calling me back. You're calling me back to the moment, dude.
It was a good moment. So
cool,
hey,
man, I appreciate it. Thanks. Yeah, thanks, man.
All right, everybody. I want to thank you for listening and watching. Hopefully this was as enlightening to you as it was to me. We will see you all on the next one.
Thanks for joining us for Cabernet and Pray. We'd love to hear what you thought of today's episode or what you'd like to see more of in the future. You can email us at cheers@communionwineco.com. And if you like this episode, please consider leaving us a 5-star review wherever you listen to podcasts. You can also find us online at communionwineco.com.